My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent most of my life wearing a uniform that has carried both pride and the crushing weight of silence. After 3 straight days of travel, a mix of long flights, cramped car rides, and sleepless hotel nights, my body felt hollowed out, the exhaustion sinking into my bones like a permanent frost. By the time I climbed the front steps of my parents' home in Asheville, North Carolina, all I wanted was the quiet of my old bedroom and a few hours of dreamless sleep. But the second I opened the front door, the stillness I craved was blasted away by a wave of cheerful noise. Laughter, clinking glasses, and upbeat chatter spilled from the living room like a party I hadn't been invited to. Streamers hung from the ceiling, bright balloons bobbed gently in the current of the air conditioner, and above the fireplace stretched a massive banner. For a fleeting, foolish heartbeat, my mind tried to tell me this might be for me, that somehow, after all these years, my family had decided to acknowledge one of my homecomings. But the name printed across that glittering banner wasn't mine. Ethan Carter. My younger brother. The golden child. The one who had always been the center of my parents' universe, whether or not he'd earned it. He stood right in the middle of the room, his posture radiating self-assurance, basking in the glow of admiration as neighbors and family friends congratulated him on a minor promotion to lieutenant. To my father, Robert Carter, this was another chance to live vicariously through his favored child's every step. To my mother, Linda Carter, Ethan's cocky arrogance wasn't arrogance at all, it was confidence. And my own quiet competence? She'd spent my entire life treating it like evidence of failure. I stood in the doorway, the strap of my heavy duffel bag biting into my shoulder, watching them. I felt like a ghost at someone else's feast. Then Ethan saw me. That familiar smirk, slow, condescending, deliberate, crept across his face, and he raised his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Hey everyone, my big sister's here. Still pretending to be a hero in that little cubicle of yours?" A few people gave awkward, uncertain chuckles, the kind that carried just enough discomfort to show they knew it was a dig. But my father didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he just didn't care. He laughed, clapped Ethan on the shoulder, and said, "Son, leave your sister alone. Somebody's got to push the papers to support real soldiers like you." And then the laughter came, a wave of it, warm and validating to them, cold and cutting to me. This wasn't just a joke. It was confirmation of the story they'd been telling themselves and everyone else for decades. Ethan was the real hero, and I was the quiet, unremarkable background character. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel shock. The truth was worse. I wasn't even surprised. This was just the latest, loudest echo of something I'd been hearing my entire life. Being invisible in my own family wasn't an occasional sting. It was the language we spoke, and I had been fluent in its silence for years. One memory, in particular, rose above the rest like a jagged landmark in a barren desert. 10 years ago, my father bought Ethan a brand new cherry red pickup truck. No birthday, no holiday, just because Ethan had been accepted into a standard state military college. My parents threw a backyard party big enough for the entire neighborhood. I can still smell the barbecue smoke and hear my father's booming laugh as he told everyone his son was finally becoming a real man. Then came the big reveal. Dad led Ethan out to the driveway where that gleaming truck sat with a giant bow on the hood. Ethan whooped. Mom cried tears of joy. And me? I stood on the porch, hands gripping the railing, watching it all. I didn't just see a truck. I saw the reflection of a lifetime's internal ledger. I saw the busted laptop I'd had to save up months to replace on my own. The advanced science camp I'd been told we couldn't afford. The decades of money's tight that evaporated whenever Ethan wanted something. That truck wasn't transportation. It was a monument. A $40,000 declaration of exactly who mattered more. Exactly 1 year later, I had my own moment, but it was nothing like his. There was no crowd, no ribbon, no cameras. Just me, standing in the kitchen under the dull yellow light, holding a thick, unassuming envelope. Inside was an acceptance letter into a highly selective special operations training pipeline, the kind of opportunity almost no one ever got. My heart pounded. This was it, I thought. This was something they couldn't ignore. I walked into the living room, where Mom was sorting mail. I handed her the letter. She glanced at it, then back to a catalog in her hand. "Oh, that's nice, honey. Just be careful." Dad's reaction was somehow worse. He took the letter, squinted at the official heading, and handed it back with a shrug. "Is that even for frontline troops? Sounds like analyst work. Desk stuff." And that was it. No congratulations. No questions. No acknowledgement of the fact that what I held in my hands was rarer than gold. The pride I'd felt just moments earlier curdled into the same old, heavy anticlimax. Over the years, that contrast, a brand new truck for a routine acceptance, a dismissive shrug for the honor of a lifetime, became a canyon. My family filled it with what I came to call the false narrative. Ethan was the brave warrior on the front lines, even though his entire career had been spent in cushy non-combat support roles. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the quiet one. They'd tell people, Natalie was never built for that kind of pressure, as if that explained everything. Once, just once, I tried to correct them. I was home on short leave, and my father asked what I actually did. I gave him the simplest version I could without breaking classification, the stakes, the pace, the burden of responsibility. But I saw his eyes glaze over halfway through. Mom tilted her head when I finished and said, "Oh, I get it. It's like IT support for the military, right?" That was the day I gave up the fight for good. It was easier to let them have their story. Safer to stay invisible. My real life, the one lived in shadows and silence, was mine alone. Lying in my childhood bed that night, hearing the laughter from downstairs, I realized they would never see me. They would only see the character they'd cast me as. And that was the moment the script changed in my head. The goal was no longer to win their affection. The goal was to present reality in a way they could not deny, twist, or ignore. The opportunity arrived the next morning over breakfast. Ethan was bragging about his unit's new commanding officer. A real hard-ass, he called him, a man no one dares cross. My father listened with rapt attention. Then Ethan announced he was going to invite this captain over for dinner on Saturday to get in his good graces. And then he said the name, Captain Daniel Hughes. I kept my expression neutral, my hand steady as I lifted my coffee cup. But inside, everything went still and sharp. I knew Daniel Hughes. He had once served as a platoon leader under my direct command during one of the most grueling operations of my career. He was a man of unshakable integrity who owed part of his career to a recommendation I'd written. Ethan had just handed me the perfect witness to the truth of my life. I folded my napkin, placed it calmly on the table, and said, "Excuse me." Then I stood, walked out of the kitchen, closed the door to the den, and pulled out my personal phone. I scrolled to Hughes D. When he answered on the second ring, my voice was steady. "Captain Hughes, this is Major General Carter. I understand you're in town this weekend. I'd like to formally request your presence at a family dinner tomorrow night. It concerns one of your lieutenants." The stage was set. Saturday night arrived draped in the familiar rituals of my parents' brand of hospitality, a performance meant to impress, but one that always seemed to have the same leading man, Ethan Carter. The dining room table was laid out like a spread from a glossy lifestyle magazine. My mother, Linda, had prepared her signature roast beef, its scent heavy in the air, wrapping itself around the room like a reminder that this was her kingdom. Side dishes were neatly lined in polished serving bowls. The good china and silverware gleamed in the light of the chandelier. Even the wine glasses had been placed with military precision, though, of course, not by me. Ethan sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair with the posture of someone who believed he owned the air in the room. He was in full storytelling mode, spinning a wildly exaggerated tale from a recent training exercise. In his version, he was the lone voice of reason in a moment of chaos, rallying his team with lightning-fast decisions that saved the day. He layered the story with just enough faux humility to keep the audience hooked, his voice rising and falling in perfect rhythm. My parents were captivated. Linda's eyes shimmered with admiration, her smile so wide it seemed to pull at the corners of her cheeks. Robert nodded in steady intervals, his jaw tight with pride, as though hearing about the exploits of a decorated general instead of his son's embellished recount of a mundane exercise. To anyone else, it might have been painful to watch. For me, the sting was gone. In its place was a kind of surgical calm. I sat at the far end of the table, silent, sipping my water. Every so often I caught Ethan's eye, but he was too wrapped up in his own performance to notice the stillness in mine. Then the doorbell rang. It was sharp, sudden, and just intrusive enough to slice clean through Ethan's monologue. He paused, mid-gesture, his hand hovering above the table like a freeze frame. Robert gave a quick, irritated glance toward the door, clearly annoyed by the interruption. With a muttered, "I'll get it," he pushed his chair back and strode toward the entryway. From my seat, I could see the front door when he opened it. The porch light framed the figure standing there in crisp lines of gold and shadow. Captain Daniel Hughes. Even in the casual setting of a family dinner, he was immaculate. His dress uniform looked as if it had been pressed seconds before he arrived. The creases in his trousers were sharp enough to cut glass. His shoes caught the light like a mirror. He carried himself with a quiet authority that didn't need announcing. It simply existed, like gravity. Ethan's face lit up with recognition. "Captain, so glad you could make it." He rose from his chair, the practiced camaraderie in his tone as artificial as the stories he'd been telling minutes earlier. "Mom, Dad, this is my CO, Captain Hughes." Linda nearly tripped over herself to get to him, hand extended, smile fixed in place. Robert followed, offering a handshake that bordered on overzealous. "Any friend of Ethan's is a friend of ours," Robert said warmly. "Please come in. Sit, have a plate." Captain Hughes was gracious, polite, a textbook example of military courtesy. He smiled faintly, shook hands, and nodded in thanks. But his eyes were already moving through the room with a trained precision, scanning in a way most people wouldn't notice. They swept past the mantel crowded with framed photos of Ethan, over the glistening dishes on the table, and then they stopped. On me. For a moment, the air in the room shifted. His expression, cordial, neutral, changed almost imperceptibly into something far more formal. His spine, already straight, seemed to align even more rigidly, his shoulders settling into an unmistakable posture of respect. Without a word, he began moving toward me. Each step was deliberate. He passed Robert without a glance. Past Linda, who was still mid-sentence in some polite welcome. Past Ethan, whose brow had furrowed slightly in confusion. And then Captain Hughes was standing directly in front of my chair. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. The sound was sharp, the snap of muscle and bone honed by years of discipline, as his right hand rose in a salute so crisp, so perfectly executed it felt like a physical shockwave in the room. "Ma'am," he said, voice clear and formal, gaze locked on mine. "I apologize for the intrusion. I wasn't aware you were back stateside." He held the salute for a moment longer before adding, "Welcome back, Major General Carter." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the casual lull of conversation pausing. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of something irreversible breaking. Linda's fork, halfway to her mouth, slipped from her fingers and clattered against the fine china with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Her hand came up to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Robert's hand, still holding a piece of roast beef on his fork, began to tremble. The tremor grew until the fork slid from his grasp, landing with a muted clink that might as well have been a gunshot. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and slack-jawed. And Ethan was staring between us like someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Captain, what are you talking about?" His voice was a strangled whisper. "That's just my sister. She works in logistics or something." Captain Hughes turned to look at him, the confusion on his face genuine and unsoftened. "Your sister," he repeated. He glanced back at me, then at Ethan, as if trying to reconcile two wildly different realities. "Lieutenant, this is Major General Carter," Hughes said evenly, his tone carrying a weight that made the title feel heavier than the air itself. She was the commanding officer for the entire Joint Special Operations Task Force he caught himself recalibrated, in a sector we don't discuss outside clearance. His gaze returned to mine, and it softened, not with pity, but with the deep respect of one professional to another. "Ma'am, your family must be immensely proud." The irony was so sharp, I could almost taste it. Ethan's words from 2 days ago, still pretending to be a hero, hung in the air between us, glowing in their own humiliation. And me? I felt no satisfaction. No thrill of revenge. Only the still, unshakable sense that I was done. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of wood against hardwood loud in the otherwise silent room. Standing, I gave Captain Hughes the smallest of nods, a thank you without words, an acknowledgement that said, "It's over." Then I turned my back on the table. I didn't look at Linda's stunned expression. I didn't watch Robert's trembling hands. I didn't so much as glance at Ethan, whose carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. I walked through the living room, past the half-deflated balloons from Ethan's promotion party, opened the front door, and stepped into the cool night air. I didn't look back. The night air in Asheville felt cooler than I expected. Crisp, almost biting, the way autumn can sometimes sneak up on you before you're ready. My boots struck the front walkway with steady, deliberate steps, the faint hum of the street lamps above blending with a chirp of crickets in the distance. I didn't know where I was walking, only that I wasn't going to stop until the house was behind me, until the weight of their stunned silence wasn't pressing against my back. I reached my rental car, slid into the driver's seat, and let the door close with a muted thud. For a moment, I just sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, staring at the faint reflection of my face in the windshield. My pulse had slowed. My breathing was calm, not because none of this mattered, but because the decision to walk away had already been made long before Captain Hughes knocked on that door. The drive back to my apartment in Boulder, Colorado was long enough to think but short enough to avoid second-guessing. I stopped once, halfway through the mountain pass, to stretch my legs and look at the stars. Out there, away from the streetlights, the sky was so dense with them it felt like you could just reach up and brush your fingertips through their cold fire. That same stillness I'd felt in the dining room was with me now, only here it was clean, uncluttered mine. When I finally stepped into my apartment, the quiet was absolute. No chatter, no clinking dishes, no stage performances for the benefit of the hero child. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floor beneath my boots. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, set my bag down, and sank into the couch. That's when my phone started buzzing. At first, I let it vibrate against the coffee table without touching it. The sound was mechanical, detached, not urgent enough to demand my attention. But it didn't stop. One buzz became another, then another. A cascade of calls, each with its own rhythm, each lighting the screen with familiar names. I ignored them until the screen went dark again. When I finally picked up the phone, it was out of nothing more than curiosity. The missed call list was a column of repetition. Mom.
Dad.
Ethan.
Mom.
Dad.
Ethan.
Then the texts started appearing in rapid sequence, their tone shifting with each sender. The first were from Linda. "Why didn't you tell us? How could you keep a secret like that from your own family? We had to hear it from a stranger in front of everyone." Then Robert's messages appeared. "You embarrassed us in front of that captain. Do you have any idea how that made us look? You made the whole family seem like fools." And finally, Ethan's. His words dripped with something darker, shame distilled into accusation. "You think you're so much better than me? You did this on purpose, didn't you? You wanted to make me look bad in front of him." I scrolled through them slowly, absorbing the shape of their outrage. Every sentence was about them. Their image. Their humiliation. Not one line, not a single word, asked what my life had really been, or what it had taken to get where I was. It was the same as it had always been. Their story, their comfort, their version of reality. I leaned back, phone still in hand, and realized something important. I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel angry. I felt pity. A deep, tired pity for people so committed to the lie they'd built that even the truth, presented plainly and publicly, couldn't reach them. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan. I didn't open it. Instead, I unlocked the screen, opened the text thread with all three of them, and began typing. I told you my truth for 20 years. You just preferred your version of the story. I read it twice, not because I doubted the words, but because I wanted to feel them settle. They weren't vindictive. They weren't emotional. They were simply final. I hit send. The little delivered checkmark appeared beneath the text, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the reflexive urge to wait for their reply. I backed out of the message thread, opened my contacts, and scrolled until I found their names. One by one, I pressed block contact.
Mom. Blocked. Dad. Blocked. Ethan. Blocked.
The silence that followed wasn't the cold, suffocating kind I'd known in their presence. It was different. This was the quiet of clear boundaries. The quiet of knowing that the next chapter of my life would be written without their interference. I set the phone face down on the coffee table and sat there for a long time, letting the hum of the fridge fill the space. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. A neighbor's dog barked twice and went still. Eventually, I stood, walked to the bedroom, and opened the window. The mountain air rolled in, cool and dry, carrying the scent of pine. I lay down on my bed, not the childhood one where I'd listened to their laughter downstairs, but my bed, in my home, in my life. The pillow cradled my head, and I closed my eyes. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I slept without dreaming. 1 year later, I stood on the side of a mountain in the late afternoon light, the air crisp enough to carry the faint scent of pine down from the higher slopes. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in strokes of deep orange and muted gold. The wind carried a kind of silence that didn't exist in cities, a silence that wasn't emptiness but fullness, like the mountain itself was listening. I was in civilian clothes now, worn jeans, a fleece jacket, sturdy hiking boots. The weight on my shoulders these days wasn't from body armor or a rucksack, but from the responsibility I'd chosen, guiding the next generation of leaders. A small group of officer cadets sat around a crackling campfire nearby, their faces lit by the shifting glow of the flames. We'd spent the entire day hiking and talking about leadership, but not the kind that fills PowerPoint slides or leadership manuals. No, we talked about the kind you only learn when it's dark, when no one is watching, when you carry the responsibility for lives in the palm of your hand and know that one wrong call can break them. One young woman, maybe 22, sat forward with her elbows on her knees, her face serious. "Ma'am," she asked, "what's the hardest part about command?" The question caught me off guard for just a second, not because I didn't have an answer, but because no one in my old life had ever cared enough to ask it. I took a breath, felt the mountain air fill my lungs, and said, "Seeing people for who they really are and letting them see the same way. It's easier to lead from a distance. It's harder to lead when you're willing to be human in front of them." A ripple of thoughtful silence passed around the fire. And then, unexpectedly, a laugh escaped me. Quick and genuine, the kind that came from the chest, not the throat. It felt strange and wonderful at the same time. I realized in that moment that I felt more at home here, among these young officers I'd only met weeks ago, than I ever had in the house where I'd grown up. Here, there was no performance, no false narrative, no scoreboard of who mattered more. Just people willing to learn, willing to listen, willing to respect without needing to be entertained first. When the session wrapped for the evening, I walked a little ways from the campfire, far enough to hear the wind over the crackle of flames. The mountain's shadow was stretching long now, the air cooler against my cheeks. I thought about how far I'd come in a year, not just in distance, but in clarity. I'd bought a small house in Boulder, Colorado, tucked into a quiet neighborhood at the base of the foothills. It wasn't big, and it wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The walls were painted in warm earth tones, the shelves lined with mementos from a life lived on my own terms. Not the forced family portraits my parents had displayed in their living room, but photos of my real family, the people I'd chosen. There was one picture of me and my old team, caked in mud and grinning like lunatics after a mission that had nearly broken us, the kind of grin that only comes when you've made it back together. Another photo showed Sergeant Paul Reynolds, the man who taught me more about honor and resilience than my father ever had. His arm was slung around my shoulders, his face sunburned from days in the field, both of us laughing like we'd just gotten away with something. Every object in that house, every frame on the wall, was a deliberate choice. Nothing existed there to keep up appearances for anyone else. Sometimes, though, news from my old life trickled in, whether I asked for it or not. My cousin Melissa Carter was one of the few family members I still spoke to. We kept it simple. No gossip, no baiting for drama. But every so often she'd share something I couldn't help but find telling. It was Melissa who told me that Ethan's career had stalled. Apparently, the story of that dinner, the night Captain Hughes saluted me in front of my entire family, had made its way through the military grapevine. Ethan's reputation had taken a beating. Without the protective bubble of my parents' narrative, the version of him that other people saw was much closer to reality. A man who was out of his depth, more concerned with image than substance. He hadn't been promoted since. My parents, Melissa said, had tried a complete pivot. After years of dismissing my work, they'd begun bragging about their Major General daughter, as though they'd been my biggest supporters all along. But it didn't work. The story that people in town wanted to hear, the one they repeated over coffee and at community events, was about how my parents had treated me for 30 years. How they'd celebrated the smallest things Ethan did while ignoring or belittling my biggest milestones. Their power, the social standing they'd built on decades of careful image management, had evaporated almost overnight. When Melissa told me all this, I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction some might expect. There was no gloating. No, I told you so. Just a quiet recognition that the math had finally balanced itself. The truth doesn't always arrive when you want it to, but it arrives eventually. Standing on that mountainside, listening to the cadets laughing softly around the fire, I realized I'd stopped measuring my life by their approval a long time ago. My worth didn't come from a banner above a fireplace or a proud introduction at a dinner table. It came from the work I'd done, the people I'd led, and the person I'd chosen to become when no one was watching. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the campfire. I turned back toward the group, my boots crunching against the gravel path. They looked up as I approached, faces open, ready to listen if I had more to say. "All right," I said, lowering myself onto a log beside them. "Who's ready for one more story before we call it a night?" It wasn't the kind of story I would have told in my parents' house. It didn't have to be. This one was mine. Back in Boulder, my life had settled into a rhythm that was nothing like the one I'd grown up with. It wasn't that the pace was slower. There were still days that demanded every ounce of focus and energy I had, but it was different in a way that mattered. The demands now came from people I respected, from commitments I'd chosen, not obligations forced on me by someone else's narrative. My morning started before the sun crested the ridgeline. I'd wake to the soft gray light slipping through the curtains, the air cool enough to make that first stretch under the covers feel like a luxury. Coffee came first, strong, black, and poured into a mug I'd picked up on deployment years ago, the chipped ceramic still carrying the faint scratches from being rattled around in a rucksack. From the kitchen window, I could see the foothills rolling away toward the Rockies. On some mornings, deer would move through the yard, their steps silent in the frost. It was a view that belonged to no one but me, untouched by the need to impress or prove anything. After coffee, I'd usually head to the local training center, a place where veterans volunteered their time mentoring young officers and NCOs preparing for advanced leadership programs. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't make headlines, but it mattered. These were men and women on the edge of careers that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. If I could give them even one lesson that made a difference when the moment came, it was worth every minute. Some afternoons, I worked with Sergeant Paul Reynolds, who'd retired a couple of years after me. We didn't need to talk much about the past. It was in the way we moved around each other, in the shared understanding of what had come before. Sometimes we'd share a look across the training floor when a young officer nailed a decision under pressure, and in that look there was pride, the real kind, the kind that didn't need an audience. Evenings were my own. Sometimes I'd sit on the back porch with a book, the light fading from gold to indigo as the sun slipped behind the peaks. Other times I'd meet up with a few close friends for dinner, people who didn't measure worth in rank or accolades, but in whether you showed up when it counted. That was my chosen family. Not bound by blood, but by the kind of loyalty that didn't flinch when things got hard. There was Paul, of course. There was also Captain Leah Martinez, who'd been one of my strongest platoon leaders years ago and now commanded her own company with a steady hand. There was Marcus Dean, a former medic whose dry humor could cut through even the heaviest days. And there was Emily Harris, a civilian analyst who'd worked alongside my team in ways most people never knew about, one of the sharpest minds I'd ever encountered. We didn't see each other every day, but when we did, there was no performance, no competition for attention. Just an ease, an understanding that came from knowing exactly who we all were and not needing to pretend otherwise. It was such a stark contrast to my old life that sometimes, if I let my mind drift back, it almost didn't feel real. In my parents' house, every interaction had been a performance. Ethan was always center stage, the favored star, while the rest of us orbited him. Or rather, I did because my parents had long since stopped noticing anyone else. I'd learned to keep my own achievements quiet, partly to avoid the inevitable dismissal, partly because I'd realized the applause they gave wasn't real. It was just another part of the act. Here, there were no acts. I thought about that often, especially when news from Melissa came trickling in. She'd tell me about some awkward attempt my parents had made to bring me up in conversation at community events, only to have it backfire when someone asked them why they'd never mentioned my service before. She'd tell me how Ethan had started avoiding certain gatherings because of the whispers. Apparently, the version of events they'd worked so hard to protect had crumbled faster than they'd expected. But I didn't let myself dwell on it. It wasn't my job to watch their house of cards fall. That was theirs to deal with. Instead, I put my attention where it belonged, on the life I was building now. One Saturday evening, I had Paul and Leah over for dinner. We grilled outside, the smell of seasoned meat mingling with the faint sweetness of pine sap in the air. We talked shop for a while, then drifted into lighter conversation. Paul told a story about his grandson's first attempt at riding a bike, complete with sound effects for every wobble. Leah teased me about my inability to keep a cactus alive, claiming it was the only thing she could ever hold over me in terms of capability. When the plates were cleared and the stars had begun to show, we sat in the quiet, each lost in thought. I found myself staring at the faint outline of the mountains, the same ones I'd see from my porch every morning. "This place suits you," Leah said quietly. I glanced over.
Yeah,
"It does." And it did, more than I'd ever thought a place could. Not because it was Boulder, not because of the mountains or the quiet streets, but because it was mine. No one else's fingerprints were on this life. I didn't have to fit into anyone's version of who I was supposed to be. Later that night, after they'd left and the house was still again, I walked through the rooms, touching the back of a chair here, the edge of a picture frame there. Every object was a choice. Every inch of space carried a piece of a life I'd fought for, not in the way my family imagined, but in the way that mattered. I paused at one photo on the wall, the team shot after that grueling mission. We were filthy, exhausted, and happier than most people ever got to be. Looking at it, I realized that this, more than anything else, was the truth I'd wanted my family to see. Not the title, not the rank, but the people, the work, the cost. And then it hit me, maybe they'd never been capable of seeing it. Maybe the truth I'd carried all those years hadn't just been ignored, it had been invisible to them from the start. I turned off the light, letting the room fall into shadow, and went to bed. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. This was my life now.
and it was enough.
It was a rainy Tuesday in Boulder when Melissa's name popped up on my phone. I'd just finished a morning session at the training center, my boots still damp from the walk back to the car. The rain was the steady, whispering kind, the sort that seemed more like a companion than a disruption. I debated letting the call go to voicemail. Melissa, and I had an unspoken agreement about not turning every conversation into an update on my family. But something in me wanted to hear her voice. "Hey, cuz," she said when I answered, her tone warm but cautious. "Got a minute?" I smiled faintly, even though she couldn't see it. "For you? Always." There was a pause, the sound of her shifting the phone from one ear to the other. "I know we don't usually talk about them unless you ask, but something happened and I thought you should know." She didn't have to say who them was. "Go ahead," I said, my voice steady. Melissa exhaled, like she was bracing herself. "Your parents tried to throw a little gathering last weekend. Supposed to be a casual dinner at their place, but from the way people were talking, it was more of an image repair mission. They even had Ethan there, trying to play it like everything's fine." I leaned against the kitchen counter, listening to the rain patter against the window. "And, well," Melissa continued, "someone brought up that dinner with Captain Hughes. Apparently, the stories made the rounds more than they thought. And when it came up, they tried to laugh it off. Your dad said something like, 'Oh, Natalie never liked the spotlight.' But then someone, I think it was Mr. Harlow from down the street, said, 'Yeah, but you didn't exactly have a problem putting Ethan in it, did you?' I didn't say anything. I could picture it too clearly. The forced smile on Robert's face, Linda's sudden busy work to avoid making eye contact, Ethan's discomfort under the table. Melissa went on. After that, the mood tanked. People stopped playing along. You know how your parents used to control the conversation? It didn't work. And Ethan, he left early. I think it hit him that his version of things doesn't work outside their little bubble anymore." There was a long pause between us. I let the sound of the rain fill it. "You don't have to say anything," Melissa said gently. "I just figured you should know." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thanks. I appreciate it." She hesitated before adding, "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. And it was the truth. Because hearing it didn't stir up anger. It didn't reopen old wounds. If anything, it confirmed what I'd already known. Walking away hadn't just been the right choice. It had been necessary. After we hung up, I stayed by the window, watching the water bead and slide down the glass. My reflection in the pane looked calm, almost detached. It struck me that the person in that reflection, the one standing here now, felt so far removed from the woman who'd stood in her parents' doorway a year ago, duffel bag on her shoulder, hope flickering for half a second before being snuffed out. Back then, I'd still carried the faintest ember of wanting them to see me. Now, there was nothing left to burn. Not in a bitter way, just in the way a door, once closed, becomes part of the wall. That night, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective, the lamplight shimmering in puddles. My boots splashed quietly as I moved, the air smelling of wet earth and pine. I passed houses with warm light spilling from the windows, the muffled sound of laughter and conversation inside. For a moment, I thought about how easy it would be to rewrite history in my head, to imagine a version of my family that had celebrated me, supported me, seen me. But the truth was, I didn't need that anymore. The life I had now wasn't built on their approval, and it didn't need their retroactive permission to be valid. When I got home, I brewed a cup of tea and settled onto the couch, the steam curling into the cool air. My phone sat on the coffee table, silent. No blocked calls, no messages I'd have to ignore. Just quiet. I thought about the cadets I'd worked with earlier that week, how one of them had stayed behind after class to ask me if I ever regretted my service. I'd told her the truth. I don't regret the work. I regret who I used to hope would care about it. It occurred to me that the same answer applied here. I didn't regret walking away. I only regretted that it had taken me so long to realize I could. Before bed, I took one last look at the photo wall in my living room, my team, Paul, Leah, the moments that had defined my real life. These were the images that mattered. These were the people who had shown up when it counted. The rest? They were just noise I'd finally learned how to turn off. I switched off the light, the house settling into its nighttime stillness. In the dark, I felt no pull toward the past. No curiosity about what they might be saying now. Some things, once you walk away from them, you don't go back to check if they've changed. You just keep walking. and I intended to keep walking for the rest of my life. The invitation came in the form of a plain white envelope slid into my mailbox on a windy Friday morning. At first, I thought it was another piece of routine correspondence from one of the veteran mentorship organizations I volunteered with. But when I opened it, the bold header told me otherwise. Keynote Speaker Invitation, National Leadership Summit, Denver, Colorado. I stood there for a moment on my porch, the paper fluttering slightly in the mountain breeze, reading it twice to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. They weren't asking me to attend. They were asking me to lead off the conference, to set the tone for an audience of military officers, civic leaders, and policymakers from across the country. I felt that old instinctive pause, the one that used to make me second-guess whether I was enough to stand in front of a crowd. But it was quieter now, almost unrecognizable. I didn't have to prove myself to them, not anymore. This was simply a chance to speak the truth I'd spent a lifetime living. The weeks leading up to the event passed in a blur of preparation. I sketched out my remarks at the kitchen table in the early mornings, coffee steaming beside me, the Rockies turning pink in the sunrise outside my window. I didn't want to give them the standard 3 keys to leadership speech. I wanted to tell them about the kind of leadership that no one puts on recruitment posters, the leadership you practice when the cameras are off, when the outcome is uncertain, when the cost is personal. The night before the summit, I laid my uniform out across the bed. It had been over a year since I'd worn it in an official capacity, but the sight of it still made my chest tighten, not with anxiety, but with the weight of what it represented. I checked every detail, the ribbons, the insignia, the gleam of the brass buttons. When I finally hung it neatly on the back of the door, I caught my own reflection in the mirror and realized how different my eyes looked now. Steadier. Clearer. The morning of the summit, the Denver Convention Center was buzzing. Attendees moved in clusters through the glass atrium, their voices rising and falling in a steady hum. Some wore uniforms, others suits, but all carried that same blend of anticipation and guarded self-assurance. Backstage, I waited behind a curtain as the event coordinator ran through the opening announcements. My name came last, just before the applause. As I stepped out onto the stage, the lights washed over me, momentarily blinding. Then the shapes of the audience came into focus, rows upon rows of faces turned toward me, waiting. I began simply. My name is Major General Natalie Carter, United States Army, retired. And for most of my career, I learned that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one who's still there when the room goes quiet. A few heads tilted. I let the words settle before continuing. I told them about the long nights in remote forward operating bases, where the only thing more constant than the hum of the generators was the weight of the decisions resting on your shoulders. I told them about the people who had shaped me, not because they held high rank, but because they held themselves to a standard that never wavered. And I told them about the cost of doing the right thing when it's easier to look away. I didn't mention my family by name, but I spoke about the danger of letting other people's stories define you, of how a false narrative can shrink even the strongest among us if we let it. Sometimes, I said, you have to stop trying to fit into someone else's version of your life. Sometimes you have to walk away, not because you've given up, but because you've finally decided to tell the truth without needing their permission to speak it. When I finished, there was a moment of stillness. Then the applause rose, not the polite, automatic kind, but the sustained kind that carries weight. People stood. Some nodded as if they'd heard their own story between the lines of mine. Afterward, during the reception, a young Army captain approached me. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I needed to hear that today. I've been wrestling with my own version of what you were talking about." I met her gaze. "Then trust me on this. Your story is yours. Don't let anyone else write it for you." Driving back to Boulder that night, I realized that this moment, standing in front of hundreds of people and owning my voice, was something the Natalie of 2 years ago couldn't have imagined without bracing for impact. Now, it was simply the next right step. When I got home, I hung my uniform back in the closet. My phone was still on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. There were no calls from my parents. No texts from Ethan. Not that there would be. And for the first time, I didn't even think about whether they knew where I'd been that day. or what I'd said, or who I'd said it to. Their chapter in my story wasn't just over, it had been sealed shut. I poured a glass of water, stepped out onto the porch, and let the cool night air wash over me. Somewhere out there, the people who mattered knew my story. The people who didn't never would. And that, I realized, was exactly how I wanted it. The weeks after the summit felt different. Not in the sense that anything external had suddenly changed. My days still began with coffee in the quiet kitchen, the foothills just catching the first light, and ended with the steady rhythm of life in Boulder. But inside, something had shifted. Speaking that day in Denver had been more than a professional milestone. It had been a line in the sand. I didn't feel the weight of my family's absence anymore. Where there had once been a hollow space, a raw, restless ache for recognition, there was now something solid. It wasn't joy or triumph, but a kind of deep, settled peace. I had built a life that was mine alone, and I no longer needed to measure it against anyone else's idea of success. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to host a small gathering at my place. Just my chosen family, the people who'd stood beside me in the worst moments and celebrated with me in the best. Sergeant Paul Reynolds, Captain Leah Martinez, Marcus Dean, and Emily Harris all came, each bringing something for the table. Paul brought his famous smoked ribs. Leah showed up with a bottle of wine she swore had battlefield-grade morale-boosting capabilities. Marcus brought a playlist of songs from our deployment days, and Emily, true to form, brought pie. We ate outside on the back porch, the air warm with the last stretch of late summer. Conversation flowed easily. Stories from the field, good-natured ribbing, moments of quiet where nothing needed to be said. It was the kind of gathering where time slipped by unnoticed, the sun setting before anyone realized it. At one point, as the light faded and the string lights above the porch began to glow, Leah looked around the table and said, "This, right here, is what it's supposed to feel like." I felt the truth of her words settle in my chest. This wasn't just camaraderie. This was belonging, the real kind, the kind I'd spent years chasing in the wrong places. After everyone left and the porch was quiet again, I stayed outside, listening to the crickets. I thought about Melissa's last update, about the awkward dinner my parents had hosted, about Ethan leaving early when the illusion cracked. But the thought didn't stir anything sharp in me anymore. If anything, it felt distant, like remembering a book I'd read a long time ago, one I didn't need to revisit. A few days later, Melissa called. She didn't have much news, just a quick check-in. At the end of the conversation, she hesitated. "You know," she said, "I think they're starting to realize you're not coming back. Not just physically, I mean you're not going to be part of their story anymore." I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Good. That's the first honest thing they've had in their story in a long time." When we hung up, I found myself reflecting on something I'd told the young captain at the summit. Your story is yours. Don't let anyone else write it for you. For years, I'd let my family's version of me, the quiet, unremarkable sister, stand unchallenged. And in some ways, I'd been complicit in that. I'd stayed silent, let their narrative dominate because fighting it felt like screaming into the wind. It took walking away, fully, completely, to realize that silence wasn't the only option. Now, my truth wasn't something I was trying to prove. It was just the life I lived. It was in the cadets who sent me thank you notes months after a workshop. It was in the friendships forged through sweat, trust, and shared burdens. It was in mornings when I woke to the sound of rain against the window, knowing I'd built the life where I could choose exactly how to spend the day. I didn't need an audience anymore. One evening, as autumn began to take hold, I hiked up one of the smaller trails behind my neighborhood. The air was cooler now, the leaves starting to turn gold at the edges. When I reached the overlook, the city of Boulder spread out beneath me, the mountains rising like silent sentinels behind it. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the clean air, feeling the ground solid beneath my boots. The view was beautiful, but more than that, it was mine. Not because I owned the land or the skyline, but because I'd chosen to be here, to live here, to build here, to be myself here. In the fading light, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who walked into her parents' house, duffel bag on her shoulder, still hoping that maybe this time would be different. I wished I could tell her that it wouldn't be. That the love she was hoping for wasn't coming. That it would hurt, but she would survive. And that one day, she'd stand on a mountain like this and know she'd done the right thing. As the sun dipped below the peaks, I turned back down the trail, my steps steady on the path. I wasn't walking away from something anymore. I was walking toward everything I'd chosen. Because in the end, you don't need a crowd's applause to be a hero. You just need to be true to your own mission. And mine had only just begun.